This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Erik Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not. Hey everyone, this episode is all about Agile. So me and Dylan are going to talk about how we have worked in Agile teams in our career, some of the different things that we've seen, some of the terms and elements that bring Agile together. And we're going to try to explain it in a way that makes sense to everyone that listens to this. After I recorded this, I actually realized I forgot to mention one important tenet of Agile, and that is the Agile Manifesto. So essentially, in 2001, these 17 software developers met at a resort in Snowbird, Utah, and they came up with these values and tenets of what software Agile methodology is. So real quickly, those four tenets they came up with was individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. There's a lot more to it, but essentially those were some of the main four tenets of Agile. So we don't get into that too much in this episode. We talk about more of the nuts and bolts of what we see as software developers working in an Agile environment. So thank you for listening. By the way, one other thing, I noticed after I recorded this that the mic gain on my microphone was a little high, so I sound a little bit distorted, but there's a lot of great information in here, so I thought I'd go ahead and release this anyways. I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks.
Hey guys. Today at Self-Taught or Not, we're going to talk about Agile. We're going to talk about the software development rules in an organization lifecycle, the software development lifecycle. So we're going to kind of hit a smorgasbord of topics, but we're going to focus more on Agile because I think that in any organization nowadays, you're going to see Agile, and everybody is talking about it in the last 3 or 4 years. It's kind of a buzzword. So, and I really like this topic too because I've been in a few organizations, Dylan's been in a few organizations, and I think everybody does Agile a little bit differently. And some organizations do a very poor implementation of it, and some do a much better implementation of it. So it'd be cool to kind of talk about our experiences. I'm not by the way, just to clear this out, there's actually, I believe, professional certifications you get for project managers in Agile. I don't have any of those, so this is just one man or two man's opinions on this process.
Yeah, real world experience. None of this theoretical, you need to go to the books sort of stuff, but there are a lot of great certificates. And I actually recommend people as one of the things they can do to sort of stand out is because Agile is such an important part, and you'll see it on pretty much every job application to go and get some. So you can look at certifications on like Scrum Alliance or scrum.org if you're interested in that sort of stuff.
Very cool. Yes. And I want to say too, one thing before we start, that especially if you're a new developer listening to this, this is going to probably be your day to day. And I would say most people, when they jump into this environment, it's very stressful for them the first time through. I was just actually reading an article on Reddit of a software developer who just got hired, was in mid-sprint. We'll talk about what sprints are and how they felt so stressed because they had all these deadlines. Software develop, a lot of companies offer no training. Pretty much they jump you into the code. Hopefully you have a good tech lead that can kind of guide you, but a lot of times you're just expected to know how to start working on the code and start contributing. And I've heard of some software developers, using drugs, like using Adderall or heaven forbid, like cocaine to like get that edge. So I just want to briefly mention that this is kind of a stressful process if you've never been through it. And if you're in a bad organization, this is not fun.
This took a very dark turn that I wasn't expecting in this Agile conversation with Adderall and cocaine. So
have you heard that? Have you heard of developers trying to hit their goals?
I have always heard of developers being stressed out. I don't think it's necessarily part of the Agile process. What I think it is part of a bad work environment. And Agile being the forcing the deadlines, and so here's the sort of on a tangent. I've talked many times about how I don't work overtime, and a lot of people are afraid to do that, and because people make deadlines. Oftentimes, even in Agile, you're supposed to agree on a deadline as a team. often you're not. You're just, hey, this is the deadline, we're doing it. And so like, to me, that's an unjust thing. So just as a public service announcement, that if you're out there doing drugs, legal, illegal, to get by, and I've had colleagues who have started drinking and become alcoholics in the past because they were so miserable at their job. So if that sounds like something that defines you, the worst thing you can do is continue that process. Go find a company that appreciates you. Go find a job that you enjoy, and don't stay there, because it's not going to change. Companies don't change. So just a little PSA. But I have heard very similar things. I don't think it's that part of the Agile process. I think it's more so part of just a bad work culture.
Yeah, good. Enough said on that. All right, so I'm going to talk about let's talk about the different roles in a software development organization first, and then we'll jump more into the specifics of Agile. So usually in any kind of software development process, you have a design phase, a phase where it gets to the developers, a testing phase, a deploy phase, kind of a systems operations, and a support. So we'll start with...
I think you sort of left out the initial like requirements and discovery phase as well.
Oh, that's a good one. Yep. So let's begin with that. So usually... Well, let me take one step back. Let me talk about some of the more specific software roles, and we'll go back to the requirements. So in the design phase, we usually have an architect. Some companies have architects, some don't. So what will happen is you'll have a set of requirements. Those requirements are taken by some sort of architect that kind of designs the higher level view of what you're going to build. So for example, we've had architects in the past go in and put together a diagram of all these systems in place for a new feature. So maybe you're hitting up a Lambda, or maybe you're hitting up a Postgres database, and maybe you need changes to the front end, and you also need to talk to a third party. So they'll write the diagrams, they'll write the kind of the higher level features, and they may even, in some software projects, they may actually create the classes, they may create some of the interfaces involved. They'll create some of the structure around the app itself before the normal developers even jump in.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention, although we're talking about Agile, typically in like a waterfall setting, all that stuff would be completely defined in a very detailed fashion, while in a sort of Agile environment, most of it is sort of loose requirements, and this is the general direction, although it can be built out a little bit more. But sort of that's part of what makes Agile is oftentimes I don't want to say you do the bare minimum to get going, but that's sort of the approach is, hey, this is where we think we're going, and this is what we're doing, and we're open to change if something better comes along.
Yep. And then so after the architect comes in, then usually that's when the developers join in, and the developers really translate kind of the architecture and the requirements, and in this case for Agile, maybe it's less requirements, and design, and they actually implement it. So you might have a developer, sometimes there's tons of different titles. Sometimes they're called software developer 1, or software development engineer, webmaster. Sometimes you just add a number at the end, like 1, 2, 3, become a lead. Sometimes there's principal engineers. There's a lot of different titles, and there's also UX designers and UI designers too. So some organizations, one guy ends up doing all, especially for web development, they might do the HTML, the CSS, and then jump into the JavaScript. In some organizations, you might just be working only on the framework, and then you have a different person that comes up with the HTML, CSS, they're kind of UI designer, and then you might have a different person that does the user experience, where they're really thinking about the flow, and they'll create mock-ups and things like that.
Yeah, and some of these things, like I would say out of the 3 or 4 jobs I've had, only one of them has had architects, and the majority of my projects don't have designers. Depending on the company, sometimes they'll just say, hey, go and build this shit for us right now. Like, so, it's very, every organization is very unique on how they take on some of these roles and some of these sort of cycles in Agile.
Then you have like a test engineer. Sometimes we call them QA, sometimes they're called automated testers, sometimes they're called software developer engineers and tests, SDE T.
Here's
You might see that.
a little question for you, because when I was doing the Dev Mountain quality assurance boot camp, I remember a section about testers or QA, and I don't remember exact context of it, but some people get upset that you call them testers, and some people get upset that you call them quality assurance, and that there's supposed to be a distinction between the two. Is this something you know what I mean? Is there something that I know you've spent some time in QA, so that's why I asked.
I have never heard of that. I know there's a lot of professional organizations that elevate testers up to quality assurance engineers. You might hear sometimes, like, they have the engineer title because they're so important. I know sometimes a lot of software developers who don't like software development. Some people get into this field and they hate it, so they jump back to QA. But I don't think I've ever heard of
I think
like tester versus QA. That would bother me. I don't know.
Their main, if I remember the point correctly, their main point was that a quality assurance engineer is writing automated tests, and whether it's end to end or whatnot, while a tester is only doing manual testing.
Oh, that's a good distinction. There's definitely, when I was in the QA world, there was a distinction between testers that all they did is they went through Excel spreadsheets and did manual testing, and they were clicking through and different things. And then those who actually were automation engineers, and there's tons of tools out there to do automated testing, and they're actually creating scripts that ran all the tests, and at that point, they were just maintaining those tests and then adding new ones anytime a new feature came in. And really sophisticated organizations would have those tests, those automated tests, be put into your CI/CD pipeline, or your continuous improvement, continuous delivery pipeline. Yeah, continuous integration.
Which sort of leads us to our next couple roles that your team might have, which is surrounded around deployments.
Yeah, exactly. Let me ask you this, Dylan, do you guys have you worked in an organization that have kind of separated sometimes they're called software release engineers or deploy release engineers, between that and DevOps, or do you have one guy that just does both?
I have, actually. And so it's sort of in an interesting state in that specific release engineer. So like my experience with the release engineer is oftentimes they're like, is this ready to go? Is this ready to go? Can we do this? It's in here, which is something you really shouldn't have to do. Like if you're adhering to professional standards, once it gets merged to your environment off of test or to test, it should be ready to go, and the board should do it. The problem is that so many people aren't super professional and will just move things along. Now, I will say that I don't know that this is actually going to be a role for very much longer, because as you have things like feature flags, and I'm trying to think of a lot of like companies like Launch Darkly that essentially allow you to turn a feature on and off. That may not be a role, but I have had it where DevOps just handles it. But I've also had where there's somebody who is on, like, their only job is to be on top of if this is ready to go out, even if it says it's ready to go out.
Yeah, that's interesting. So by the way, DevOps is kind of like development operations. They're the guys in the background, usually taking care of all the servers. Sometimes they're doing the release management. Yes, a lot of these jobs have been automated by different services out there. There is software as a service, but there's also like platform as a service. I'm thinking like Heroku and even the next one, like operations. Usually you might have a sys administrator. Sometimes the sys administrator handles just like everybody's computer in the office, but sometimes they're also responsible for like any of the servers that you guys use to put your code on. And that's being replaced a lot by like Google Cloud Platform. Like the DevOps engineers like create all the scripts to create all the environments, but sometimes you don't have like a system administrator per se anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't even throw like a system administrator into sort of the DevOps role. At least in my experience, they've sort of been separated.
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, everybody said, oh, we need a system admin because everybody's hosting all their servers locally. And now since everything's in the cloud, that's transformed to we need a DevOps guy that can create. Usually they use like Terraform or CloudFormation, because everybody has their, especially in large organizations, everybody has their computer on the cloud, and now you need people to maintain that and keep that up and running.
Yeah, which
go
is oftentimes where those system admins go. They go to DevOps. It's sort of this natural progression that occurs. Every DevOps guy I've ever known has either one, got way sick of like normal development, or two, they were a system admin. They're like, look, this job ain't going to be around too much longer, and I want to make money, and they transfer into DevOps.
One more in the last of the pipeline is support, and these are the guys that usually do everything from answering phone calls to emails. Sometimes they're called customer success engineers. A lot of companies have created names what their support teams are. It's a thankless job, I hear. It doesn't pay as well, but it's definitely needed in the pipeline.
Yeah, no, it's I know that I've talked to quite a few people who have been in this role, and many of them unfortunately have aspirations of moving into more technical roles, and that's how they do it. But that's far and few between. I've seen people do that at organizations that they've worked at. But it can happen. But it's probably one of those roles that you're not going to make more than $20 an hour, sort of thing. And so, it's gonna be, you're gonna be struggling, and it's not. No one wants to do phone support or tech support or anything like that. At least I don't think so, because it is one of those jobs where you're dealing with frustrated people all the time.
I did it for a number of years, and I can attest for that, definitely. One thing I didn't mention in here, there's a whole new budding. I don't know if this is like the last few years. I feel like data science has become a huge thing.
Oh my
Everybody's
goodness.
Everybody's trying to get into this field, because you can take your data and try to make correlations to your customers, like where they're going to spend their money, what maybe, like, you could tie it into marketing. There's just so many things you can do with data science.
Yeah, various in-depth statistics on how to get money off various statistically things. Like our average customer base is actually 13 to 18, and this is what these people like. And so, yeah, data science, if you were to look at the best jobs for 2018, 2019, top 10 are all data science related, AI, machine learning, whatever it is.
Very, very cool. Actually, they just had a big data science conference Amazon just did in Las Vegas. And they even had they had Jeff Bezos, of course, the CEO of Amazon. And then they had Iron Man there. Robert Downey Jr. was at this like data science convention, just talking about like AI and how he approaches it. It was kind of strange, but interesting. Like it's a big deal.
Getting those checks, RDJ over there.
Exactly. Okay, so that was a kind of a long explanation, but those are the different roles. So let's jump into Agile and how we know of it. And so Agile is kind of a methodology in software development where you have these tight iteration cycles where you are coming up with requirements, you're kind of quickly designing, developing, testing it, and then getting out to the customer. So it really has this sort of...
So very rapid feedback loop is really its goal.
Exactly. So you really want to try to get feedback quickly. So just quickly, there is something called Waterfall. It's a lot of organizations started there. I was actually in an organization that went from Waterfall to Agile, and that was kind of a rough transition. And that's where you really have a long time period where people are coming up with the requirements. That's sort of what what we need to design, what features we need to create. And it's just kind of like, okay, you have these perfect requirements to get up to the developers develop it, it gets to the testers test it, and it gets released. But that whole process, there isn't a lot of iteration in it, and it's sort of looked down upon.
Yeah, and part of it, I mean, you sort of painted a very beautiful picture of Waterfall with perfect requirements. And even in a Waterfall system, that's never the case, because until the client or the user base actually gets it in their hands, it's a very iterative process just naturally. Oh, now that I see this, I thought of this. Now that it's like this, I thought of this. And then you're like, oh, you know what? Now we don't actually need this. So ideally, we'd like to think as software engineers, we can gather the perfect requirements and we can build the perfect system. But the sort of real world examples of waterfall don't always go that way. And not to say that agile is much better. You just have the opportunity to fix it in a much more fast-paced fashion.
Yeah, I've been in waterfall projects that have taken like 2 months, and I've had it like the estimation is a tricky process in waterfall and agile. But what I found in waterfall is that it's more business driven and less developer driven. So there'll be these crazy deadlines that don't reflect reality, and they're really hard to hit, and there's no changing them. And oftentimes projects get pushed out. So something that should have taken a month ends up taking 2 or 3 months. And the business is like, why isn't this done? There's more stress. But that's all I'll say on waterfall. If you guys are interested in more waterfall, let us know. Tweet us out at Erik Siege. But so for agile, I've seen teams where they say they're agile, but they're pretty much agile in name only. And so they might only be, maybe they're just doing Scrum, which are daily stand-ups, but they really don't do any of the other things that agile has to offer.
Yeah, that's like it's such a meme now. I think you can buy it on a coffee cup. Like, we're agile, we do stand-up sort of thing. Like, I know that I've worked at an organization that was very much like that.
Exactly. And so what does it mean to be agile? So I'll jump in here, and Dylan, I'd love to hear what it is. And by the way, this is not the right answer to do agile. There's many different ways to do it. And I think even between me and Dylan, we have different ways that we've done it in the past. And
yeah,
so usually
there's different methodologies. We're probably going to be focusing on Scrum ideally, because that's probably the most common one that businesses seem to like. But there's also things like Kanban, and there's other items that are agile methodologies, but there's multiple methodologies within agile.
Correct. So the way I see it is usually the process starts as you have a product owner that works closely with the management, the executive management, and also closely with the customer. And then they come up with either a feature that they like to implement, or a set of features. And those get broken down into epics or stories, and then tasks that need to get done.
And when we say epics, it's think of it as a very large feature. So there's various terms for how we're going to deliver features, and sort of they start with the largest being epics, and then you have like features, and I always forget the list, but a lot of these are just terms for features and how large they are.
Exactly. And what happens is after the product owner comes up with this feature, they might actually use analysts to help come up with actual details of what the feature is about.
If you have a product owner, I've been on teams, believe it or not, that don't have one, which makes it very interesting of how you get requirements. But
yeah. What is it, like the management just send the requirements in?
Yeah, I mean, I've had it where like people have literally sent emails with it. They're too busy to give you requirements, which is just ridiculous. I've also had it where, sometimes as organizations grow, they, from a 20-person company to a 500-person company, they they run it in the same fashion, even though it's not possible. So you still have the same 5 people making all the decisions for an organization, which is why because they don't trust their employees, or they don't trust anyone to do it themselves, which makes it very hard, because then you have one product owner for 15 projects, so you never get any time.
That's hilarious. Especially if you're getting like emails and things like that. That's no good. You should, at that point, if you're an organization that their idea of requirements is to send emails with loosely like 2 paragraphs, and not actually get it officially written down, or in a lot of times people use something called Jira. It's like a management project management system where you can write down all these stories and the tasks down. Then that's not good at all. Although I've actually had an organization once where they would print out the requirements in pieces of paper and then give it to us and put it on our desk. So not great. So after you kind of have hopefully a product owner to write down the requirements, maybe with an analyst input, and they're broken into tasks, there's usually some sort of process where there is a sprint, and a sprint typically can be between, I would say, 1 week to maybe at the longer end 4 weeks. But
I would say the standard is 2 weeks.
2 weeks is a great standard. So the 2 week sprint is what they do after. This is kind of complicated, but I'll try to make it simple. Is there'll be a sprint planning session with the developers, the product owners, and hopefully by that time, all the stories have been written. And they'll do what's called an estimation of what needs to be done. So they'll plan the hours, and this is usually done either between story points, or sometimes people have hours. And I won't get into the specifics of that, but essentially they're trying to estimate how much time each one of these tickets will be and how much can be put into one sprint.
Yeah, I would say depending, most organizations that use Scrum, it's going to be story points. The story points are typically a level of effort and difficulty, which typically will translate to more hours, but that's sort of the main distinction there.
And the way it works is like they'll say, okay, developer A, we think you can do 10 story points this sprint, and then they'll assign each one of the stories will be assigned these story points, and sometimes this it's assigned kind of by group consensus. That sometimes they call it poker planning, where they'll actually use poker cards that have like 1 to 5, and if everybody turns over a 4, then that thing will probably be 4 points. And so one developer will be like, you can do 10 points. These two story points are 4, and there you have 1 for 2. And that'll be your 10 points for this sprint. And then product management has to do is they measure if you were able actually to get all 10 points done, or if you were able to get more points done, or if you were able to get less points done. And then they have to analyze this. They have something called burn down charts, where they take a look at how many points were allocated and how many got done.
Yeah, and sort of the point of all this sort of numbers is to figure out the velocity, which is how many points the team can complete on average, and so that they can make estimations based off of that. Like, okay, well, we have 50 points here. You guys normally do 50, so it's not unreasonable to say that you're going to get this done in your 2-week sprint. One thing that my team has done that's a little bit unique in the past is we typically don't assign tickets. Or an old team, I should say, and we let the developers essentially pick and choose the tickets that say, okay, well, this is what we want to get done. The idea there being is that you're going to go and make sure you go to whatever probably tickets inside and out, because people are going to know different parts of the application. And then if you hit a point where all the tickets are done, you typically, or at least we typically would rally behind and say, okay, hey man, I see you're still stuck on this ticket nobody wanted. Let's see if I can help you out on that.
Yep. And then every sprint they look at how many points the team accomplished, and then they'll adjust next sprint. If they found out nobody could get their tickets done, all the points done, maybe they lower the point estimate for the next one, or at least individually maybe.
Or they just assign as many points as they want because they want their features, which is another common practice that shouldn't occur.
Yeah, that shouldn't occur. I can imagine. I've been in organizations like that. It's like, oh, you didn't get it all done? Well, we're just going to give you the same amount for next time and hope the outcome changes.
Which sort of, back to my point earlier about not working overtime, sort of really enforces it. Because like if I say, look, I can do 10 points, you're like, great, here's 20. And then you're like, well, I'm not going to put in extra time for these 20 because part of Agile and what we've sort of been talking about in Scrum is like typically a team agrees like, okay, this is our this is our objective, this is our goal. Our goal is to finish these sprints. We're committed to this, and so it's when stuff like that happens, your commitment goes down a level sometimes.
And I have had teams with that we've done hours instead of story points, just because product management really likes the hours because they can see how much time people are actually working rather than points were much more ephemeral. But I know there's arguments on both sides, which is better. I've done it both ways. So after you've done your sprint planning, usually the sprint starts. And in that case, you have those 2 weeks to work on the stories that you were given. And every day they have something called a daily stand-up, or sometimes also called Scrum. And that's where you have a 15-minute kind of how are you doing? What did you do? What are you going to do tomorrow? And if you have any blockers. And that is really important because it keeps track of, like, if you are way behind on something, you should probably say during your stand-up, like, hey, I'm still working on this. I can't help it. And also during those meetings, you have someone called a Scrum Master. They're in charge of keeping the meeting 15 minutes. They're also in charge of kind of tracking everybody's time and how well the sprint's going. You might also have a product owner in that meeting, and that person is the one that helped write a lot of the requirements and stories. And so they're also looking at how well the sprint's going, if everything's going to be hit. And then, of course, all the developers and usually the development manager.
Yeah, Scrum Masters are sort of a unique role where their goal is to kind of keep the devs on track. I have a friend who calls Scrum Master dev babysitters. And so, like, there's a little bit of truth to that. Is like their goal is to make sure that if you have any blockers, they try and help reach out, connect you to who you need to connect to. They also need to make sure that they're communicating to maybe the project management manager or the product owner that, like, look, we can take in more stuff, or look, we're going at a really slow pace. This ain't working out. So you need to plan accordingly.
After you do the daily stand-up, usually during the sprint process, there's something called backlog grooming. And this is a part of Agile. Agile is really supposed to be where you're focused on the customer. You're trying to continuously deliver your product as fast as you can. But there's also a certain part of being Agile, well, you can change requirements. And that really kind of gives you a competitive advantage rather than the old waterfall method where you're kind of stuck with the requirements. So what they do in the backlog grooming session during the sprint is they'll take a look at all the stories that are on top of the list of stories that need to get done. And so they might delete some, they might add some, they might change a little bit. Obviously, they won't change something a developer's working on, but usually if
what
you have
are you talking about?
maybe sometimes that happens, and I guess that does sometimes happen.
It shouldn't, but it does happen all the time. How many projects have you been on that have just been canceled? You've been working on something for a couple of weeks. They're like, oh, you know what? The business changed its mind. Or you know what? Do exactly the opposite of what we told you. In the real world, these things do happen, although they shouldn't.
Exactly. Yeah. Now that you think about it, it's definitely happened to me before. I've been pulled off projects getting deleted.
Yeah, I've literally sat down with product owners. Listen, this is the company's number one priority, and just like stressing you out beyond belief. And then 6 weeks later, hey, that shit's canceled. It's like, what?
So that's essentially the backlog grooming. They're just being an Agile method. You're really trying to work fast and doing what's best for the customer. So you might have changes. And if you have your story points that are assigned to you and you go back to the backlog to see what you need to pick next, those new stories will be at the top, or the next time you start a next sprint, you should be grabbing the stuff at the top of the backlog.
Yeah, and usually the backlog is maintained by a business analyst who is creating these stories and these tickets, and there's some sort of order, priority order, so that you know what to work on if you need to pull something from the backlog, because you're like, oh, well, we had 40 points and we did 40, but we still have a week left, so you might pull something in. Then
after the 2 weeks is up, there's usually a sprint review, and in this case, the sprint review, and I don't know. Let me ask you this, Dylan. Do you guys have a sprint review and a sprint retrospective? Some people combine those two.
No. So typically, what I have is a sprint demo followed by a sprint retrospective.
Okay, so sprint. Some people call it different. I've called it a sprint review, yes, but it could be called sprint demo.
I say review and retrospective used interchangeably.
So sprint review would be like a demo. You would actually kind of do a full demo of what you worked on to the management or the product owner, the any other one of management who wants to see what you've done during that sprint. I've had organizations that do this pretty consistently, and then I've had ones that don't do this at all. But it's kind of a nice thing to have, because then QA management can see what you guys did at the end of the sprint.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I've had this inconsistent as well, but it's one of the items that I really do wish organizations would do more often and make sure that their product owners and their stakeholders, people are asking for this, show up for that 1 hour meeting a week, because not only that, you get a lot of insight into what it is that they oftentimes want and what it is that they don't want, so you can provide more value as a developer. But it is something that, for whatever reason, at least at the organizations I've worked at, is far and few between. They, I would say 3 out of 4 times people aren't showing up to these things, or you're even doing them.
After the demo, there usually is some sort of retrospective, which is, I like these. It's, you kind of, everybody sits down in a room together. Sometimes you have people, sometimes virtual, sometimes in person. By the way, any of these can be virtual or in person. But you kind of talk about what you did right, what you did wrong. You can look at the problems you had from last sprint, where they fixed on this sprint. A good Scrum Master will keep a document or an Excel spreadsheet or a Confluence or a wiki of all the things that were discussed during this meeting, and then kind of follow up with them to make sure that they were wrong. So for example, like you might find that the end of the sprint was like super crazy and no one got anything done because of XYZ. So the Scrum Master should write those down, and then it should be corrected on the next sprint.
Yeah, and oftentimes, one thing to keep in mind is that in a very big part of Agile, like the smallest unit is the team rather, and you succeed as a team and you fail as a team. You need to start to take that same mentality with the retrospective, because anytime you go and you're saying what we did right, that's an easy one, but then you say what we did wrong, you have to have a little bit of class isn't the right word, but you have to tread carefully and just understand that this is a team game, if you want to think of it that way, and not a solo game. So you have to take that mentality in this retrospective.
I've had retrospectives where people flat out said, like, I really hated this process, I don't really like this, and really dug into other people. And I've had retrospectives where everybody's a little afraid to say anything. So it's like, did we do anything wrong? And then it's just like crickets, even though we know half the people are pissed off about something.
Yeah. And, I am a believer of, as we were talking about before this podcast started, I am a believer of brutal honesty. That doesn't mean that you're going to be mean. That doesn't mean that you're going to single people out, but it does mean that if you're not going to try and make your team better and make your environment by virtue of that better, then you're just going to continue to keep making those errors. And so you got to speak up. You got to let your voice be heard. And people are scared to do that because maybe their manager doesn't really want to hear it. Maybe the product owner doesn't want to hear it. But at the very least, you'll get it off your chest, and you can maybe see some change down the road.
Yep. And that's essentially it. That's the full 2-week cycle. And then you start again with another sprint planning. And hopefully you've learned from the previous sprint. You've estimated, you'll start another estimation of the new stories that are coming out. Also, product management should really look at the hours, and the estimates should be really delivered and created by the developers and not product management. Maybe the product management, you're always going to have deliverables and you're always going to have timelines. I don't think any organizations get away from that. But hopefully, if you're in a good organization, that those timeframes are really catered to the output that the development team is doing, and that those are used essentially to create the deadlines instead of the other way around, where the management creates the deadlines and then you have to shoehorn it into your Agile process, which doesn't work as well.
The goal is for deadlines to be in a sense of reality. So I've had people come down screaming, say, I need this in 2 months. And then you're like, all right, let's do an estimate. It looks like it's going to be 9 months. And they're like, get it done in 2 months. And like, hopefully the Agile process at the end of the day is to give realistic estimates based off of previous deliverables, where you say, look, this is what we were able to do based off statistically, and there's always a margin of error in either direction. Sometimes we can do more, sometimes we can do less, but you can't ask for triple the amount of work to be done. It doesn't work that way. And hopefully, part of Agile and those story points or those hours will prove that.
And I really like the idea of Agile, which kind of, it ties into a couple of other ways of doing software development that really highlight code quality and just continuous improvement. Like, for example, pull requests. Having a method, Agile really promotes the idea of doing pull requests, having someone else look at your code and improving it. I would say also pair programming is another part of it, which is kind of synonyms of Agile too, which is where you sit with another person and you actually code together.
I know a lot of this podcast has been me sort of bringing us back down to reality about what it's like in the perfect world, but like a lot of organizations will pick and choose what parts of Agile, unfortunately, they want to do. But if you were to go and read things like the Agile Manifesto, there are things that, like, this process is supposed to be designed to have quick turnaround. And so there are things that part of that process is writing testing to make sure that you can deliver rapid feature development and things like that, making sure you don't break anything and that you are delivering a quality product. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations will pick and choose what they want to have of Agile, which is why it's sort of all over the place. And, some do it better, some do it worse, is the nice way of putting it, I suppose.
The last bow I want to tie onto this is there's an idea called CI/CD, which is continuous integration, continuous deployment. And if you have your Agile process finely tuned in with your CI/CD pipeline, you can even get rid of sprints at that point, because you're going to be continuously looking at the backlog, grabbing new points. There are going to be backlog grooming sessions continuously. And then you're continuously deploying that. You're integrating it into a pipeline that does automated testing, that does automated deployment. So you can get into a fashion where you don't even need sprints, and that's like kind of a higher level, bigger discussion. But I have heard of organizations that have kind of tried to go to the complete CI/CD.
Have you worked at one? Because every organization I have, we CI/CD to stage. And like nothing, I've never worked at an organization that does it straight to production.
Well, I think what the idea is, you would get to the point where you still have like a staging environment and maybe like a user acceptance environment, but then that would be still manually triggered to go into production. But the idea is like, we're not going to time box our developers into these 2-week sprints. We're going to have these stories. As soon as they're done, they're going to get into our acceptance and testing environments, and then they're going to be deployed out. So you have, in between the sprint, you might have 3 or 4 deployments out to production.
Yeah.
We're not going to wait until the end.
So
and you don't even have sprints at one point.
So that's not my understanding of CI/CD by what I've read about it. It's actually you are delivering it straight to master, essentially, and straight to production. And part of that is you're obviously going to have feature flags. You're going to have test surrounding it, and that test or QA is actually going to go to production and make sure that this is working properly on that environment, and that you are sort of delivering a quality of it's done, so ship it and we'll check it while it's there. That has been my understanding of CI/CD, although I haven't met a company that is ready to pull the trigger on that.
You're right. That is a more clear explanation of what it is. It's literally every time you create a feature, it goes directly. You don't even have branches. It goes directly into master branch. And then all the automated tests and everything that you have in place catches 99% of the bugs. And then it can go directly into production. That it would be like a true CI/CD. You're right.
Yeah. No, I mean, I haven't worked at a company like that. And because other than that, I mean, to go to test and stage, who really cares about that? Like it's usually after it gets merged into your dev branch or master branch, it's going to go to test. But I've had long discussions about whether companies should do CI/CD, and to me, it's one of the things that I would love for organizations to pick up, because I think it would force developers as well as businesses to be more professional. Because there's always this, when you like, oh, well, there's going to be 5 people that are going to check, and it's going to have to hit test and stage and QA before we ever get there, that then you have to ship a quality product, and you're going to be more careful before you submit that PR and it gets merged in, and you're going to make sure that it's fully tested. So I'm very pro CI/CD, but I haven't worked at an organization that has actually gone all in, I guess.
It's like a mythical creature that you hear about, but no organization really does. It's kind of an ideal that we all want to strive for, but we can't get there.
Yeah, and it's like, well, part of that is like, well, how are we going to jam these short timelines and these unreasonable, confusing requirements, and how are they going to hack it out instead of actually taking the time that's needed? Which is why I'm very big on code quality and standards and things like that. Why I think CI/CD is an excellent thing if you can do it properly. So that's. I know what this is about, Agile and sort of the software development lifecycle, but we touched on quite a few things in this podcast. This is one of my more favorite ones. I think we did a pretty good job.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that just about wraps it up.
All right. So this is another episode of Self-Taught or Not. Look forward to another great episode, which will leave you in suspense to figure out what it is.
Later.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at erik.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members, and you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.